Boker Tov Givrin.
Boker Tov.
Ma Shlom Kim. You don't have a lot of conviction there on Tov. Must be the weather and the traffic outside, plus the translating orally, right? The pressure is on. Okay, we were looking here at 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 6, where we have Vayehi bevoam. Notice the zakef katon, the two dots above the aleph in bevoam, and so we're going to stop there because that's a disjunctive accent. Vayehi is a Vayic tol form of the verb. It is a cal imperfect third masculine singular from haya, the verb to be. Now, Vayehi is often used in what we call as a macrosyntactic marker. As a macrosyntactic marker, it is used to start or to mark off a section in a narrative. And that's what it's doing here. We are concluding one scene. The scene was Samuel being addressed by God, sent by God to go to Bethlehem, his arrival in Bethlehem, and in a sense you have a different scenery there because he's arrived at Bethlehem, but it's all kind of put together there in a sense in the structure in the total text here. The narrator wants to keep moving you along rapidly until this point. And so although there is a physical scene change in those first 5 verses, their narrator isn't marking those scene changes by special means because those scene changes are not really integral to the core message of this text. So we've seen Samuel enter Bethlehem. We've seen the elders come trembling to meet him. They ask him, "Have you come in peace?" He responds, "I've come in peace to offer sacrifice to Yahweh." And he says to Jesse and his sons, "Sanctify yourselves." And he invites them, or he summons them into the feast of the sacrifice, into the sacrifice itself. Then at verse 6, we have Vayehi. Notice Vayehi is followed by a beit preposition on the infinitive construct, the cal infinitive construct, bo, that also has a third masculine plural pronominal suffix on it. And this is another occurrence of bo in this text, so don't miss it for vocabulary on Thursday. So whenever you have Vayehi, and immediately after it, you have some form of an infinitive construct with some preposition on it. And beit on it is very often the preposition that will be used. Because the beit preposition on infinitive construct has the idea of when. All right? Has the idea of when. So if we translated these first 2 words literally, it would be something like this. So it came to be when they came. Or so it happened when they came. And notice though it goes on with a Vayic tol verb, Vayara. Then he saw Eliab. Now that just jars. It doesn't sit well in English. It is not a good flow. It does not make a good transition. Because you see in the Hebrew, when you have Vayehi as a macrosyntactic marker, followed by an infinitive construct with a preposition on it, that is normally just a temporal clause that is to be marked as a transition into a new major section of the narrative. And so it's best just to translate it. When they entered, when they came. Remember the preceding line? They went into the sacrifice in the preceding verse. So when they came, he saw Eliab. Notice the Vayara, the Vayic tol form, we're not translating the conjunction. We're not translating the conjunction. We're taking Vayehi vevoam as a temporal clause, translating it. In other words, there's 2 conjunctions here in a row that are not translated. When they came, he saw. Got that? When they came, he saw. Notice that haya in this case has the meaning to come, not to be, not to happen. It's come. Haya often has this type of meaning, and it occurs in a wide range of contexts, but almost always when you have wayahi here is not being translated. I forgot we have bo here. Bo is our come here, not wayahi. There are cases where wayahi will be translated and he came, or and, for example, wayahi devar Yahweh, and the word of the Lord came, is the way it'll be translated. That's not here. We have bo here. Takes care of that. So let me back up off that a minute, lest I cause you too much confusion too early. All right? So the wayahi just disappears. It's a macrosyntactic marker here. The bevoam is when they came, and that's all it's translated there. And then wayara, you don't translate the conjunction in order to facilitate the easy transition from the temporal prepositional phrase with the infinitive construct. Everyone with me so far? Let me read that translation through the Athnak one more time. When they came, he saw Eliab. Okay, any questions about the translation? I'll go back and take a look at wayara with you and explain it, but Scott.
Is it just knowing the context and the fluidity of the translation that we know that the conjunctions are dropped out, or is there something there that tips us off?
It's the wayahi that tips you off, followed by an infinitive construct with a preposition.
Okay, and so every time when we see that, we know that's just, it's almost kind of like a marker, just like
That's right, exactly. Exactly. That's exactly what I want you to see. Wayahi as a macrosyntactic particle is normally followed by a preposition on an infinitive construct. When you see it as you do here, then you know that that wayahi is not going to be that significant, and the wows are not going to be that significant, and the wow following that phrase is not going to be translated, like on wayara. James?
Just to be clear, when we see that, we don't translate the wayahi.
There are some cases where you will. So don't say never. All right? But in those cases, you normally will not translate the wow on it or the following verb. And it depends on the infinitive construct or on the word following wayahi, whether you translate wayahi. Okay? All right? But the main thing to mark here, remember, we're in a narrative context, and this is marking off a major section of narrative. And so if you are preaching through this section, your outline should have a outline break. It should have a new point here of one kind or another. Whether it's a major point or whether it's a subpoint, there should be a break here. If you're diagramming it, this is a major section being started. And so it will go back out the right-hand margin to show that as compared to any previous section or following section. This is a section marker. John?
So is the wayahi a marker, but is it actually a word though?
Oh yes, it's a word. Yeah, it's there in the Hebrew spelled out. You pronounce it, you say it.
But it's in English, it doesn't.
And in English translation, in this case, it is not translated. Just like F is not translated unless it's a preposition. Okay? There'll be times when it'll be translated, so you have to be sensitive to that. But with this particular case, Bivoam says everything that needs to be said.
I was just trying to think, in their mind, what do they think when they see that? Is it?
Well, what do you think when you say to someone, hurry up and come down here? Do you stop to think about that up has no meaning in such a situation?
Well, I look at hurry up as a whole phrase it means.
All right, that's what they're looking at. But it's still a word. Okay? Just like up is still a word in that situation.
Yeah, okay, I see.
All right? And they're looking at this as a phraseology, an idiomatic expression, where every word fits together and says something, but one or more of the terms have basically a zero element for meaning. They're not taken literally. Okay? Yes? Stop.
Does the yaha help the preposition to mean when?
Wayahi?
Wayahi.
No. The base preposition on any infinitive construct will normally mean when, regardless of the context and regardless of what precedes it. Okay? All right? Anyone else? Okay? Let's move further then. The second half of this verse was translated, then he said, or it could be so he said, and ak is a particle. It's an emphatic particle. It means indeed, surely, certainly, obviously. Neged is a preposition meaning in front of or before. Not before time-wise, before physically. It's the idea of being in front of. Yahweh. Prepositions have their objects follow them immediately. Yahweh is the object, in front of Yahweh. Mishicho. This is the word Mashiach, Messiah, literally, Messiah. Messiah means anointed one. The O ending is third masculine singular pronominal suffix. So it's his Messiah, or his anointed one. It's a noun clause, so we have to supply the verb. So we supply the verb, a form of the verb, be, and so it's before Yahweh is his anointed. And some have translated this the way Scott translated it initially. He said, before him is Yahweh's anointed. And the confusion is that someone reading this, if they don't recognize here that it's Samuel talking, they might think he's talking about himself, or might think that they missed a double quote or something. But literally, you could translate it that way, because the third masculine singular pronominal suffix at the end takes Yahweh as its antecedent. And so it's Yahweh's anointed. And you'll see a number of English translations that, in order to smooth this out, will say that Yahweh's anointed is in front of him. Yahweh's anointed is before him. And so they've kind of switched and put the third masculine singular pronominal suffix with neged and put Yahweh with Mashiach. It's acceptable, but I don't prefer it myself. I think it's clear to try to make certain that we understand that it's before Yahweh is his anointed. Make it very clear. So if someone misses the double quote, or if they're not listening carefully as you're reading it and not realizing that Samuel is speaking, they might think it's Samuel that he's in front of. Okay? So I just like to keep things extra clear. Double quotes make no sound when you read. All right? Jeff's sitting over there. You can do this sometimes to let people know. Give a gesture. All right, let's move on then to verse 7. Verse 7, let's take John Strickland.
Again?
I did get you before. I don't need to get you. I don't need to get Kenny, Gus, Scott, David Lee. David Lee, thank you. Speak up. If I call on you a second time before I've called on everyone else, you make certain that you protect yourself. All right? He just wants to share the joy with you, David. And on verse 7, we have a long verse, so read to the Athmac, please.
Wayomer Yahweh El Simuel El Tavet El Mer'ehu We'el Givoah Komato Ki Me'astihu.
Good. Translation?
Yahweh replied to Samuel, "You shall not look to his appearance or to his great height, because I have rejected him."
Excellent. Very well done. Let's take a look at this. Wayomer, you're familiar with. Yahweh is the subject of Wayomer. El is a preposition unto, and so it gives us the indirect object. Samuel, Shemuel. And notice the revia over the aleph in Shemuel. That's the quarter marker. And the disjunctive accent occurs prior to the beginning of the direct discourse, the quote that we'll put in double quote marks. Al is the negative. The al negative is a temporary subjective negative, primarily found with jussive verbs. And so that gives us a clue about the verb tabate. And so as we approach tabate, we know that we have a negative here. It's going to be not to do something. We look at tabate, and if you tried to look it up as a tau, baith, taith, you found out you couldn't find it. So then you have to look for something else to have occurred. You might have thought, well, maybe this is a PL imperative with a tau, baith, taith root, and you found that wouldn't work. So you say, okay, the tau has to be then a prefix. If the tau is a prefix, it is an imperfect prefix. Since there's no suffix, this is a second masculine singular. Since it has a pathak under the prefix, then you have to consider that it is most likely going to be a hifil. So far, we have tentatively identified a hifil, imperfect, second masculine singular of a root which has a baith and a taith in it. The next thing we look at is the dogish in the baith. The dogish in the baith would normally not be there because you do not follow an open syllable with a dogish, a hardening dogish, in a begad kafath letter. If you have an open syllable, as ta is an open syllable, then that baith will not have a hardening dogish. So this has to be a doubling dogish. And as a doubling dogish, then that represents a double baith in pronunciation. What situations lead to a double baith in pronunciation? Well, one is to have a pay yod or initial yod, a position 1 yod verb that's assimilating, and another is to have a noon, a pay noon or initial noon, a 1 noon verb like nathan, and here navat. And so if you start looking for letters that will be assimilated, and the letters that are assimilated, you know already from various verbs like the nifal, the noon assimilates. You know that from the nifal. You know it from the min preposition, that noon assimilates. And whenever you see something like this where something may have assimilated, the very first thing you must think of is the noon. Yes, a yod can assimilate. Yes, a lamed assimilates only in la kach. But noon is the primary culprit. 90% of all initial assimilations in the Hebrew in verbs is an initial noon. So watch for that. You know it occurs in nifal, and be aware of it here. And so then you go to the lexicon and you look up navat. And when you look up navat, you find out it is a verb. It means to behold, to look. And you'll find out that it is found in the hifil in the exact form that you have here. It's a wayik tol, hifil, imperfect, second masculine singular from navat. And before I answer Chad's, don't forget it, Chad, please. Okay? Hate to put you off, because I don't want you to forget it. All right? The reason for the tsere under the baith is because the hirik yod of the hifil has been shortened because it's a wayik tol verb. Wayik tol verbs in the hifil will attempt to shorten the hirik yod whenever possible. Whenever possible. The hifil imperfects and the wayik tol will attempt to shorten the hirik yod to a tsere, and they succeeded here. Chad, question.
How do we know that it wasn't an aleph or a hay that disappeared?
Aleph or hay never assimilate. They just disappear. They leave no trace.
So how do we know that something was assimilated and rather than just disappeared?
First of all, we're going to talk about that in a little bit because we haven't covered the pay noon verbs other than in your reading. But it's one of those that do. It's just a fact of Hebrew. Noons assimilate. They don't just disappear.
My question is, when I look at this verb in this form, how do I know that something has assimilated as opposed to disappeared?
All right. The reason, again, is because the dogish and the baith. You do not expect to see a dogish in the Baith because it's immediately preceded by a vowel, a pathic. So then you have to ask yourself a question. This cannot be just a hardening dogish on a bagad kafas letter. It has to be the doubling dogish. If it's doubled, why? Why is it doubled? Is it doubled because it's a piel, a pual, or a hithpael? Is it doubled because it's a nifal imperfect? Should I look for a nifal triangle? And when you look for a nifal triangle, you don't find one. So you rule that out. You don't have the pointing here for a pual or a piel, because if you take it as a piel, then the tau has to be part of the verb root, and we found out by looking at the lexicon it's not part of the verb root. And so that then leads you to the only other conclusion you can reach is an assimilated noon for the root. Okay? All right? Yes, Scott.
Regarding the potential of it being a PL form in an imperfect, the pathic under the tau would never be there if it were a PL imperfect?
If it were a PL imperfect, you would expect a schwa
Right.
under the prefix,
But
right?
it wouldn't change.
It still doesn't change even though you go down to a two letters showing the root. It normally still will not change, not this direction.
So the pointing typically under the prefix is a pretty good indicator.
It's a pretty good indicator at least 85 to 90% of the time. Okay? All right? And then you have el, the preposition unto, mara'ehu. Mara'eh is a noun, meaning appearance. Hu is a third masculine singular pronominal suffix. Wa'el, the conjunction and the preposition, and unto. Gevoach is a noun. It's also used as an adjective. And here it is the highness or the height of. It is in a construct. The schwa under the gimel gives you that potential clue. And then komato is from koma or kuma, another noun with a third masculine singular pronominal suffix from the root kum, which means to rise or to stand, and it's his standing or his height, the highness of his height, the elevation of his height, the height of his stature, many translate it. Ki, by context, is because. Ma'astihu is a cal perfect first common singular. That's why you have the T. Okay, cal perfect, first common singular. Ma'asti, and the hu is a third masculine singular pronominal subject that's the object. Because I have rejected him. And we had that statement made earlier in the chapter as well, when he asked Samuel why he was mourning. Right? James.
The last key, how does that go with the next section?
The next key, or the next two keys, first of all, notice you have an athnak under ma'astihu. So you stop everything right there. Okay, we haven't got to the second half yet. But stop there. And always do that in your translation. Don't transfer words from one side of disjunctive accent to the other side of disjunctive accent in your translation. All right? Always allow the disjunctive accents to divide the thoughts of your verse. Do not attempt to take things after the athnak and insert them into the translation of words before the athnak, or even vice versa. Don't take words that occur before the athnak and insert them in the translation of words after the athnak. All right, gentlemen, let's finish up on verse 7, and then we're going to do something different after that. And we'll come back to this again. Like I said, I want you to continue working on this. I want to walk through it with you. I want to make certain we've looked at it. I've got your written translations of chapter 16, verses 11 through 23, and I can interact with you on that separately and individually to help you on translation. I will read the whole thing in class, or I will hand out a copy of my translation of this whole chapter to you next week, so that you can see what I have done and the types of decisions I made, and some of the annotations with regard to grammar and syntax that you can keep and use. I'll have that as well, but I'll go over the other verses, but I want to try to just walk through these 10 because you were asked to prepare them orally and you were asked to make certain you were ready for it. And obviously, since there are 20-some people in class, only half of you are getting called on this time, but the other half of you will be called on for the next translation, you see, as we start going through. So keep that in mind as we go. Let me make one more comment before we move too far along here in the second half of verse 7, and that's to go back to verse 6 again, just for a moment. When I mention macrosyntactical, macrosyntactical means macro is large, great, all right, as opposed to micro. Microsyntax, like microgrammar, has to do with relationships of words within phrases and clauses and sentences. So that when you look at a sentence like in verse 6 and you have bivoam, there's microsyntax there, that the third masculine plural pronominal suffix on the infinitive construct is the subject of the infinitive construct in this case. The base preposition helps it to be a temporal clause, and that's microsyntax. You go further, you see Wayara eth Eliav, and you know that the verb there has a third masculine singular subject, he saw. That's microsyntax. That's within a clause, within a phrase. Eth Eliav is a direct object of that verb. That's microsyntax. Macrosyntax has to do with sections and paragraphs. It has to do with many sentences, you see. And so when we're talking about macrosyntactical marker for Wayahi, we're talking about it marking off a paragraph or a section. It's looking at larger elements of syntax. It is a syntactical element giving you a major marker on the section or paragraph level, rather than being on a phrase level or on a clause level or a sentence level. Okay? So that's why we call it a macrosyntactical marker. And again, the macrosyntactical marker occurs here at verse 6 in 1 Samuel 16, because it's at this point that the whole purpose of this narrative begins. This is the focal point. This is the important part. Verses 1 through 5 are merely introductory. They're merely preparing us for this. But this is the heart of it. If you're going to preach this passage, you don't major on verses 1 through 5. Even if you give it one whole message, you make certain that it's still viewed as introductory to this, that this is the heart of this narrative. This is the core of this narrative. This is the major purpose and intent of the author in presenting this narrative, and it's identified by a macrosyntactical marker to make super clear to everyone that we have begun a new section. It may not include all new thoughts, but you've begun a new presentation, whether of new thoughts or old thoughts. You've begun a new presentation, and in this setting, in this chapter, this is very significant. Now, there are other ways to confirm that besides just the Wayahi as a macrosyntactical marker, and we'll talk about those as we go along and go through this section. All right, let's move on then and finish up verse 7. We had David Lee do the first half. Eric, why don't you take the second half, if you would, please. Read it in Hebrew and then translate.
Ki lo asher yireh ha'adam ki ha'adam yireh leah or la'enyayim wa Yahweh yireh la'levad.
All right, translation.
For not which he sees or the man sees, for not which the man sees, or not, for it is not which the man sees. I
Good.
kind of want to insert.
Yes, excellent.
For it's not which the man sees, for the man sees to the eyes, or I guess you could say looks to the eyes, to the appearance, but Yahweh looks to the heart.
All right. Now, let's walk through this and explain it. The key belongs with what comes after. In fact, this key, I would prefer not even to translate as for, as though we're giving an additional cause. Because then you have to ask, okay, if this is an additional cause, then it's a cause within a cause. Because he's been told, don't look at his appearance or the height of his stature because I have rejected him. So does this next key go under I have rejected him because? Or is it going back and looking again at tab 8, don't look at, and then giving a second causal? Now, it's not giving a second causal because it's not begun with a conjunction. If it was to be a parallel key to the preceding, ki ma astihu, then it would have a wow on it, because I have rejected him and because, right? So whenever you find a key like this that begins a major part of a verse after the logical divider or at the beginning of a verse, you have to ask yourself the question, could it possibly be an emphatic key? An emphatic key you translate as indeed or certainly or surely. It's almost like the ak we saw earlier. Indeed, it is not, or certainly, obviously, it is not what man sees. Now, ha-adam here is being used generically of mankind. And so it's not, we wouldn't translate it as the man because it's not talking about any particular man. It's not even talking about Samuel. It's talking generically, it's mankind. So it is not what man sees. If you use it without the article, then it sounds generic in English without using mankind. You can use mankind, you can use human beings. Whatever you use, make certain it sounds and looks generic. It is, indeed, obviously, is not what man sees, because, here's a causal, this cause is on the first part, because man looks on the outside, literally to the eyes. An idiom here for looking at the outside, looking at the appearance, as Eric said, as he gave his alternate translation for it. It's that which the eyes see. Some have translated this, but man looks with the eyes. Okay? The problem is, however you translate this, remember you have the exact parallel construction at the end of the next clause. But Yahweh sees with the heart? No. He sees the heart. He looks at the heart. So therefore, la enayim is not that man looks only at the eyes. It's the idea he looks only at what the eyes see. He looks at the exterior. But God looks at the interior. Man looks at the outside. Man looks at the appearance. Man looks at what the eyes see, but God looks at the heart. All right? Now notice here. This we've had the verb. In fact, I didn't discuss it before, and I said I would back in verse 6. Wayara. It's a wayic tol form there. It's a kal imperfect third masculine singular from ra'ah. And that hey dropped off up there in verse 6, which we have learned that the hey can do. And then we come down here and we find yira'eh. Yira'eh is a kal imperfect third masculine singular. Instead of having an O-class vowel over the second root letter, here we have a segol because of the guttural. Why not an A-class vowel? For some reason, the Hebrews did not like the sound of an A-class vowel in this verb, so it doesn't occur. They use an E-class vowel instead. And so here we have three occurrences of yira'eh following the occurrence of the wayic tol in verse 6 and a noun from the same root form in verse 7, because mara'eh is a noun that's formed from the same root, appearance. So gentlemen, what does that tell you about this verb root? Vocab quiz on Thursday. This is the key word to this chapter. Ra'ah is the key word in this chapter. It's what we call the leitmotif. It's a German word, and you'll see this spelled this way, leitmotif, and it's the idea of a key word, the key theme. All right? Key words in Hebrew texts often identify the theme, and this word identifies the theme. You'll find it again and again, and you'll find the key statement is right here. That man does not see as God sees. Man looks at the outside, God looks at the heart. But remember, the same verb ra'ah was used earlier. You're to go to the household of Jesse the Bethlehemite because what? I have seen for me a king there. All right, among his sons. Ra'ah. And there it can be translated, I have chosen, because ra'ah can have the meaning of to choose as well as to see. Ra'ah can have the meaning of provide as well as to see. And in this context, you have ra'ah used in a number of different ways to tie this narrative together with this key word. And we're not through with it yet. It is the key theme here. And as that key word, and as this is the key section because of being set apart by that macro syntactic marker, Wayahi in verse 6, and we're still in that same section that begun. We haven't had another major break yet. This is the key verse. It's the key thought, it's the key verse with the key word in the key section. Therefore, this is the heart of what you would preach on and focus on. It's what the writer intends us to understand and see as the whole purpose of telling us this story. It's to learn this lesson. And it's going to be a lesson that's going to be spoken, and it's going to be emphasized by illustration, because we're going to see how Samuel kept attempting to use his eyes. And God had to keep on reminding him, no, 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 you don't choose on the basis of physical appearance. And he kept saying, surely this is the one. And it was someone, catch this, it's irony in the narrative. It's someone who isn't even there. He's invisible. He's not seen, is the one who is chosen. That irony of that is a key foil for this whole narrative. It helps to heighten its interest for the reader or the listener. And you wonder, who is he then? What is he like? And when you finally get to him, what is the focus on? It begins, ironically again, with his description. Talks about him being ruddy of appearance and appealing to the eyes. And you say, but wait a minute, I thought it wasn't about what you see. It isn't about what you see. He's chosen unseen, seen only by God. But then when he comes on the scene, he is described. He too has a likable appearance, but he's not as tall in stature as some of his older brothers. And we find out more about him as we look at it. But this is the key. He's chosen not because of his ruddy appearance. He's chosen because God looks at the heart. And that is going to be one of the themes of David. Remember, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are a chronicle of the house of David. They are the history of King David. They are primarily that story. Yes, you have an introductory section here in the first 15 chapters before you even get to David, because you have to set the stage. How did David come on the scene? You have the situation of the tabernacle, then you have Eli, you have Samuel. You have Samuel set up as being the one that's God's spokesman, the one who is God's prophet. He's going to be the one who is going to anoint David. He's the one to whom the people come and want a king in chapter 8. They get a king, Saul, and notice he's chosen on the basis of his appearance, because this is the type of king they want. They want a king that is tall and strong and a warrior like all the other nations. So they get a man who stands head and shoulders above everyone else, a man of superior ability physically, a man of superior military ability. And yet the irony of it all is, if they let God choose, they get one who's even better, because where Saul slew his thousands, David slew his 10,000s, according to the people's testimony. He slew a giant in chapter 17 with just a sling and a stone. And we've got all kinds of things going on, but it's all leading to the point that this is the story of David. And this is a key part of that. And at the very start of this story, it's going to start the way it ends. David is a man after God's own heart, because God looks at his heart. Everything about David is about his heart. Yes, he had a great appearance. He's probably better looking than his older brothers. Yes, he was a warrior, a better warrior than even Saul. But that's not the point of the matter. Why did God even preserve his life after he committed adultery and murdered? Because of his heart. He grieved about that in his heart. He sincerely repented of that in his heart. God still had to punish him for that, would not allow him to build the temple. But that's still the issue, is the heart. And it begins here, gentlemen. Because you see, this is not only the key to this section, it's going to prove to be the key to the entire history of David. And so as we're preaching, as we're looking at these books, and we follow along, we have to pay attention to such matters. Now, if you're reading along in Samuel, say, well, man, I would have never thought about all that. Let me tell you, there's some excellent resources out there to help you. One is Paul House on Old Testament theology. All right? He has a book on Old Testament theology, and I forget now what the exact title of it is, but it's by Paul House. And he goes through the books, book by book in the Old Testament, talking about their theological purpose and their theological messages, and he lays out for you the way the books present that. If you want to see more about how he does that, get his commentary on 1st and 2nd Kings in the New American Commentary series. He did the commentary on 1st and 2nd Kings in the New American Commentary series. In reading that, you can see what his method is and how he exegetes and how he applies it theologically, and he goes on to give application to be used as truths to be applied to our lives today as well in that commentary. And if you want to cover Samuel, you go get Robert Bergen, B-E-R-G-E-N, B-E-R-G-E-N, Bergen. You get his commentary on 1st and 2nd Samuel in the New American Commentary series, and he goes through and does basically the same thing, but not as systematically and carefully as Paul House does. And they are superb in helping you understand that there is a goal, the purpose of the entire narrative, and it has a role, and where the key verse is, and where the key teaching is, and where that begins, and why it is emphasized, and how it plays out through the rest of the story. Superb commentaries. In fact, if you're looking for a good Old Testament commentary set, first of all, make certain you have the Expositor's Bible Commentary. But after that, I would highly recommend the New American Commentary for the Old Testament. I can't say a whole lot about the New Testament. I've used a few of the volumes. But the New American Commentary for Old Testament is absolutely superb in all the volumes. There's only one commentary in all the New American Commentary on the Old Testament so far. There are a few volumes yet to be published. There's only one book so far that I felt was really not up to par with the other commentaries. And that was the commentary on Amos. But it's in a volume that has two other books in it. I think it's Hosea, Joel, and Amos. And the Amos part is terrible, unfortunately. But the other parts are fine. Okay? All right. Yes, question, John?
I have two questions. One grammatical.
Yes.
In the verse 7, between the key and the low,
Yes.
it's that vertical line again.
That's the vertical line again.
It's
And
a
here,
disjunctive accent.
here it is again, I believe, a disjunctive accent
But
causing a
isn't that
pause.
also a conjunctive accent under the
You
key?
have a conjunctive. You had the same thing back in the other occurrence too, that you had the munach with it, right?
So, I mean, it's like,
It takes the munach and stops it. And I believe this is another, I would say that the Masoretes themselves see this as a disjunctive, and therefore it has the idea of the emphatic key, certainly or obviously. Notice also a revia on the negative low. And the revia there I take as being a topical marker, not a disjunctive accent. And it's topical because it's emphasizing the negative. Indeed, it is not. And you're almost forced to stop there temporarily before going on and realizing what is not. What's so obvious, or what's certainly or indeed not. Okay, another question?
yeah, well, what we're talking about the whole context of David in 1 Samuel, what always confuses me is that, yeah, we get, if you just read this, we're like, oh, here we're meeting David as this guy that even know, but we got the story of Goliath happening first, and then they get here and it's like they never even heard of David. And And Saul then, in the next verses, like Saul's never met David before. It kind of seems like it.
Well, Goliath is in chapter 17.
I thought it comes before.
No, it's after.
Oh, this is our introduction.
Yes, this is before Goliath. Okay? But you're on a track, though, because there is something about that, because in chapter 17, there is a point there where something is said that seems to be out of order, and that may be what you're thinking about.
Yeah, I know. I remember reading something
Right.
where it's like,
Yeah. There is an
didn't
issue
know
there.
about him.
Yeah, and I just refer you to the difficulties in the Bible published or written by Gleason Archer, or to some of the hard sayings in the Old Testament by Walt Kaiser, where they both respond to that issue in chapter 17. But there is an issue there that's related to what you're saying, but it's not here. Okay? Yes, Jeff, you had a question?
You said the key words often identify the key things.
Yes.
Does it help us find key words? Does it help to look at frequency in the context?
Frequency.
Okay, so
Frequency and also the strategic placement of those words.
So frequency, strategic place,
Yes.
then we'll be able to identify the key things.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
I was thinking about that, because what about the word boa? Because that's used a lot too.
Yes,
And how
but
do you know which one,
okay.
other than, I mean, this is, it's pretty obvious for the.
But Bo is never used in any strategic text that deals with something that is a superb truth or anything of that stands out. It's just used as part of the narrative of moving people around. And you've got Wayomer also being used a lot. You've got a lot of words like that, and yet they aren't the themes, unless there's something that is unusual about their placement and that. So you have to realize that some of the common words will be repeated over and over. Ra'ah in some contexts is common rather than thematic. But here it's thematic because it's part of a statement like this, for example. Okay? All right, anyone else? All right, let's stop right there with 1 Samuel. And let's go to the weak verbs. And last time we got about this far in chapter 26 on page 160. We had talked about the pay yod, or the initial yod proper, how it remains, how it stays, like in yetev, yitav. And we are next going to talk about assimilating, the pay yod assimilating. That's in the top half of page 160 in the textbook. When we talk about the yod assimilating, that means it's going to assimilate and be compensated for by a doubling dagish. That's why earlier when we were talking about nabat, we talked about up here that nun most frequently assimilates, yod sometimes assimilates, and lamed assimilates in lakach only. Nun is far more frequent, but yod does occur as an assimilated consonant in verbs like yatsah that you see up there, yatsath, yatser, yatsag, yatsak. What do you see about all of these verbs that is common besides a yod? I didn't hear anyone say it. Sade. Sade. Notice that. The assimilating yod verbs very commonly have a sibilant as the second root letter. Not always, but very commonly have a sibilant. And it's the sibilant that enables that. Remember, a sibilant is something with an S sound. An S sound. Notice all 5 of these are a tzadi. And so it's that type of situation. So if you see a sibilant and you see a dagish in it and you have an imperfect form with a yod or something at the beginning, you're looking at it there, and you're going to look it up in the lexicon to try to find out, because you finally determine that you have a prefix and you have only 2 root letters showing. Always try the nun first, but then go to a yod. Okay? Try a nun first, because the nun occurs on a lot of sibilants as well. And a nun occurs in close to 90% of assimilated situations. But also remember the yod, and especially if it's a sibilant. If it's not a sibilant, it's most likely going to be a nun. Now, as we look at those, we look at, for example, yatsah. Yatsiya is a hiphil imperfect third masculine singular from yatsah. Yatsah is the cal perfect third masculine singular. Notice that that form, as you look at it there, there's something missing from it. It has only 2 root letters. Where is the dogish? Look at the next form, yatsar, yitzrehu. Now you have a dogish. Why does one not have the dogish and one have it? And why are both called assimilating? Some think that the Masoretes just failed to put the dogish in that first word. It only occurs once or twice in the entire Hebrew Bible. And it could be an accidental omission, either by the Masoretes as a whole for some obscure rule, or perhaps by the document that we use for our Hebrew Bibles, which is one manuscript and one manuscript only. Manuscript Leningrad Densis B19A is the manuscript we use for this Bible. So it's not comprised of the distilling of the testimony of 5,000 different manuscripts. This is one manuscript. So could it be that that one manuscript scribe failed to put it in that one place? But it still has, there's more than one of these that occurs this way. But we know that this verb form does assimilate. And in most cases, a verb form like this will have a doubling dogish, as you see it in the second form down here, where you have yitzrehu. That's a cal imperfect, third masculine singular, with a third masculine singular pronominal suffix. And the doubling dogish in the tzade shows you the assimilation of the yod from the root yatsar. Yes, Jeff?
In the book, I think you have the dogish in.
And I think that we put that dogish in there. I don't think it should be there. I'll have to, let me double check. We may have put that there in the textbook for studying it and for having it here. Dr. Buznis and I went through one time and said, how many unusual forms do we include here before we cause confusion? And one time we said, we're going to include it, but we'll talk about the opposite outside the book. I'll double check that and make certain. But I believe that that may be the reason why it's put in there. That's the form you would expect, and yet it occurs in this other form as well. Yes?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand your little table here, or what's assimilating.
The verb is yatsah. It begins with a yod as the first root letter. This is an imperfect. As an imperfect, this yod is the prefix. So where did this yod go? The same here. Yatsar. Yod, first root letter. This is an imperfect. This yod is a prefix. So where did this yod go? This one, you see what happened. It assimilated with a dogish. This one, you don't see what happened because you don't see a dogish here. Roger.
The second yours. In the middle.
Here, that's the Hirik Yod infix for the hiphil. This fits the hiphil pattern, a pathic under the imperfect prefix and a Hirik Yod infix. Yes?
Are there other forms other than the hiphil that dogish doesn't appear in that verb?
This is cal.
Up above the...
Oh, here?
Yeah, where there is
With,
no
well,
dogish.
first of all, keep in mind, there's no guarantee that any verb you have in Hebrew is going to occur in all the stems.
Right.
And I'd have to look that up in the lexicon to find out. It may not occur in any other stem. But that's for the lexicon to tell us. You'll only know that when you go to the lexicon. Okay? All right, let's go next. We want to talk about, now we've seen that a yod can assimilate. Let's go to that verb form that assimilates far more frequently with far more forms. That's what we call the pay noon or initial noon verb. Nathan, he gave, is a very common form of the verb. Nachal, he inherited, he possessed. Nasa, he lifted up. Natsal, he rescued. Nakar, he was strange. Natah, he planted. Those verbs all have an initial noon. And those initial noons, this is on page 161 of your textbook, whenever the noon is supported by a schwa, in other words, if the form in the strong verb would have a schwa under it, like in yik tol, that's a cal imperfect, third masculine singular. When you see yiktol, it has a schwa under the first root letter. Yik, tol. Cal imperfect, third masculine singular. If you have a verb that has a noon where this kof is, the first root letter, then it will be either rejected or assimilated to the following consonant. Rejection, tain. Tain is a cal imperative masculine singular from Nathan. The noon just disappeared. It's not there anymore. The prefix tau of the imperfect that was there in the imperfect that was removed to form the imperative does not cause the noon to recur or to reappear. It is gone. Gash, the same way. Cal imperative, masculine singular from na gash. Tenu, cal imperative, masculine plural with a shurik from Nathan. Sa'i, cal imperative, feminine singular from nasa. All right? The noon is just rejected. It disappears. It does not occur. It was assimilated in the imperfect form that you took the prefix off of. But the only reason the dogish recurs in these first three forms is that the tau, the gimel, and the tau are all three bagad kafath letters. And if they are following a closed syllable or a disjunctive accent, they're going to have the hardening dogish in them. But all three of those, the dogish will disappear if they're following a preceding open syllable or long vowel. You can see it here with the scene, because there was a doubling dogish in that in the imperfect, but it's removed when you go to the imperative. So there's not even a sign of a doubling dogish to maintain there. You can't have a doubling dogish if there's no vowel to go with that letter. And so these are just hardening dogishes there. Assimilation is the other current. Titain, cal, imperfect, second masculine singular from Nathan. Nigad. Nigad is a nifal, and it is a participle, masculine singular. Remember the comets as opposed to nifal, nifal. We talked about that last week. Nigad is the nifal perfect, third masculine singular, or it is a nifal imperfect, first common plural. Several possibilities. Yipak is a cal imperfect, third masculine singular from nafak. Now, our time's up, so we're going to have to quit. I'm going to come back to this again next week, or next Thursday, this coming Thursday, not next week. This Thursday, we'll talk more about this. I want you to understand this verb and how it works, the pay noon verbs. They are one of the most often recurring ones of all these weak verbs we talk about. And they're the ones that cause the most confusion because some of them, like Nathan, end up with only one root letter showing. So we're going to talk about that a bit more.